What is up, guys? Welcome back to the ECS cluster series where we are looking at building an ECS cluster that's ready for production. In the previous video, we looked at the architectural diagram that represented that the cluster that we want to build, and we looked at the various components that are involved and how it is that we'll translate those into Terraform modules slash code and then be able to deploy our infrastructure onto AWS. Now, we did two things in the video as well. Number one, we looked at setting up the file structure, and then we set up the provider here. In this video, we're doing two things. One, we're going to set up the backend, which will keep our state, and our state is essentially a record of what we have provisioned on AWS, deployed on AWS. And then we're going to set up the VPC, which is the network layer for our ECS cluster. Right, so let's get started. All right, let's get started with our backend. And in order to set that up, we'll say backend, Terraform backend. We'll choose S3, and then we'll say bucket, and the bucket name, Terraform state bucket cluster modules. Okay. Now, if you look at this bucket here, that's the name of the bucket I created on my account, and I would recommend the same if you're following this. Create a bucket on your account, and then come and type the name of that bucket here. Okay, and then the next thing we want to set up is the key, which is essentially the path where the Terraform state file will be found. And then we want to look at the region, which in my case is EU West 1. And then we want to encrypt to, right? And then the DynamoDB table that Terraform will use for state locking is going to be state lock, right? Cool. Backup set. We are done. Very simple, right? Now let's get into the VPC, right? There's a couple of things that we're going to do here. We're going to set up the main module here. We're going to set up variables, and then we're going to set up outputs. But one thing I did think about as well is setting up this locals file. And basically here we're going to have any sort of information that we're going to pull from AWS. So if we need certain information from AWS, this is where we'll do it, and we'll keep it in a variable here, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So if we could say locals, basically what we want to do is we want to have the names of the availability zones within the region that we're using, right? And it'll make sense why when we do the VPC. So data dot AWS underscore availability zones dot available, meaning they are there. We want the names, right? And we want the first three, right? Whatever's returned to us, we want to index it from 0 to 3. Cool. Now that we have that, let's go into the variables. I like to start with my variables. I don't know why, but I've just always liked that. Cool. We'll have variable VPC underscore name. It'll be type string. And then I'm just going to copy that for speed, right? So we'll have a region, we'll have tags, and then we'll have the VPC CIDR, which will also be a string. So let me just do that. I'll come back to this one here. This one will just be the region, and this here will be the tags. And with the tags, we're going to have an object with two key value pairs, which will be the owner, which will also be a string, and then environment, which will also be a string. Perfect. Done with the variables. Let's close this file, close that file, and then start working on the main. And in working on the main, I'll put my variables on the side here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to minimize the file structure here so that I have a single view. Right, so when it comes to the VPC itself, we are going to use a module. we are going to use a module that already exists, right, in the Terraform registry. So how we will find that is by saying Terraform dash and AWS dash modules slash VPC slash AWS, right? And the version here will be 5.0.0. I'm locking it to that version so that even if, and there are later versions, we're not affected by any upgrades. There's certain things we're going to focus on when it comes to the VPC, right? So we'll have names, we'll have the CIDR and the AZs. Okay, we'll also do subnets. Okay, we'll do database related setup. We'll do net gateway, and we'll do just general configs, and then we'll do tags. Right, now let's go up here. When it comes to the name, obviously we'll get that from var.vpc name, which is our variable there. Cool. Then CIDR, same thing, get that from the VPC CIDR. And then in terms of AZs, now how I like to do AZs is a bit weird, but I like it. Basically, I create this array, and within that array, the indexes themselves become, I concatenate the region that's passed to the module, and then tag an A or a B or a C, right? Because that's just the general naming convention on AWS for availability zones, right? So if I do that, this will then become C, and this will become B. Perfect. And that's it. It's really simple. Alternative, what we could have done as well is, since, let me just bring this up, is since we have the name of the AZs here, which will essentially be the names, we could have just passed them here as well. So that could have worked. But I just have always done it that way. So now, in terms of the public subnets, we are going to approach it very differently, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to do a loop of, and this is why we're requesting this data from AWS, right? We're going to loop through all the names that have been passed to us, right? And every time we loop, we are going to use a function, native function to Terraform, in which we'll pass in the VPC CIDR. And what this function will do, and then we'll pass it just some values. And what this CIDR subnet function will do is that it'll automatically calculate a CIDR for the subnets for us, so we don't have to type it out, which I've always liked. So now we're going to copy that twice, and in copying it twice, we're going to say private subnets. I did say that this assumes you know Terraform, so if you're not following quite well, I really apologize for that. So for this one, we're going to add 4, and for this one, we're going to add 8. All right, cool. Now, for the database setup, what we want to do is we want to create a database, and this is just in case the application that's deployed here will need a database. So that database would be essentially deployed in these subnets here. So we're creating a database. So essentially what we're saying is, take from these subnets here, create a subnet group. That's what we're saying. Right? Remember, subnet group always needs two private subnets or 2 subnets. So then we're going to say create the database subnet route table. We'll also say true to that, and that we're done. Next is the net gateway. Net gateway is very important because what we're going to do is the cluster itself is going to be sitting in private subnets, which means it's not going to have public IPs, and therefore doesn't have a way to will not have a way to communicate with the outside world. The advantage to that is that the outside world can't communicate or get into our cluster without really permission, right? So that's good. And so, but obviously the disadvantage is that we also can't communicate with the outside world. And what the Net Gateway will do is that it'll allow our resources that sit in the private subnets to be able to communicate with the outside world, right? So, and that's very important, especially when we set up an ACS cluster. So what we're going to do is we're going to say enable Net Gateway. We'll say true, and then in saying true, we only want a single Net Gateway. Let's say true to that as well. Okay, and then some VPC configurations that are general. What we're going to do is we want to make sure that the VPC has been enabled for host names, and then also we want to make sure that it's been enabled for DNS support. True. And then for any public subnets, we want to make sure that we're mapping IPs on launch for those resources. Tags are going to be quite relatively straightforward for public subnet tags. What we're going to do is we're just going to say name, and what we're going to do is we're going to concatenate the whatever the VPC name, small name is, and we'll say public subnet, right? And that's what it'll essentially do. I'm wondering, no, let's keep it simple. Let's do that. And then I'm going to copy that twice for, okay, and this is for the private subnets, and this is for the public, sorry, the database subnet tags. Cool. And then lastly, okay, yeah, that looks fine. Okay, cool. Then lastly, I'm going to do now the VPC tags, which will allow us to essentially name our VPC on the console. And obviously for that, we will pass in the VPC underscore name. And then for general tags, these will come from whatever tags we've passed it. Right. Cool. And that's it really for the actual module itself. And now what I'm going to do is in the outputs, I just want to do I want to do an output here, right? And I'm going to call it VPC ID. I think that's the most important one to deal with for now. And what we're going to do is we're going to say VPC ID. Okay, cool. And this is what's going to be made available to other modules that need to reference the ID of this VPC. Cool. Yeah, that's it for this module. I think this video is getting long. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop here. And then in this next video, what we're going to do is we're going to import this module into the main.tf file, as well as start on the ECS cluster module as well. Guys, thank you so much for watching. Highly appreciate it, and I'll see you in the next video.